She kept her roses alive on a diet of secrets and bone. Imagine a garden so impossibly lush that visitors swore the flowers must be bewitched, petals like velvet knives, scent thick enough to pull you toward the soil itself. For 3 winters the hedges at Crowe Hall glowed with a color no botanist could name and no scientist could explain. People came from county seats and market towns to stand silent beneath that impossible canopy, breathing as if some private altar had been unveiled. They never knew what nourished those blooms. They never guessed the cost hidden under the loam. Not yet. If you want to keep hearing what I am about to reveal, subscribe now and write in the comments where you're listening from. City, county, your state. So this secret can find a place to land beyond these words. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. I will guide you, if you accept, deeper into a house of grief that refused to be ordinary. This is the story of Evangeline Crowe, of the roses she tended like a jealous god, and of the young women who vanished into her beds so that her garden might swell and glow. Crowe Hall was built of pale brick and pride, the main house sitting squared and stern atop a rise that watched over the valley. Its history was respectable: land deeds, marriage settlements, portraits that smiled politely from gilded frames. But contained beneath that respectable veneer was a hunger that would not be named in polite company. When Jeremiah Crowe died one bitter February morning, the house inhaled with him. Evangeline's mourning did not close, it hardened. She dismissed field hands, kept her girls close, and turned inward to the green rooms where she whispered to roses, as if they were the only living witnesses left who could carry memory. She wrote in journals that read like the notes of a surgeon and the prayers of a necromancer. She recorded pulses, the color of nails, the cadence of breath. She believed, or convinced herself, that life could be transferred, that beauty could be fed on the living. Tonight you hear how belief became visible, soil braided with sorrow into bloom, and the family ledger beginning to collect names like rain collects thunder. Now, Jeremiah Crowe's funeral read like a proper chapter in a respectable family's history: hymns, stiff collars, measured condolences. Evangeline, however, did not leave the grave when others did. She sat until the soil had settled, stripping petals from her wedding bouquet and letting them fall as if marking a new equation between death and beauty. Those who survived that house in later years said her mourning slipped into method. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the family physician, began to note differences that unsettled him. She began to measure instead of weep. Her day was reorganized around the glashhouses and beds. Her nights were given over to journals full of numbers, to mixtures of powders and liquids whose labels read like a language only she understood. She dismissed the rough laborers but kept a cohort of young women close at hand. Housemaids, seamstresses, girls with nimble fingers and steady backs. They were assigned vital work before dawn, hauling heavy buckets, kneading strange fertilizers into frozen earth, pressing their bare hands into the roots until redness bloomed where skin should be pale. Evangeline tracked every breath, every tremor, every small decline in weight. The first of these girls to collapse was Sarah Caldwell, just shy of 17. She was found one winter morning, slumped against a trellis, her energy spent like wax. Her hands bore a deep crimson stain that resisted washing and explanation. Dr. Hartwell described Sarah as exhausted, malnourished, and chemically scarred in ways his training could not name. Evangeline's reply was not the wail of a mistress who had lost a servant. It was the calculation of someone who believed the corpse held a resource. After Sarah's burial in the family plot, under moonless sky, Evangeline was seen digging at the gravesite and carrying the loosened soil back to the rose beds. When Martha Henley confronted her, Evangeline spoke of tribute, of returning dedication to the land, claiming the soil enriched by devotion would nourish the blooms. The doctor, alarmed, asked for samples of the unknown substance staining Sarah's skin. Evangeline refused, insisting on household privacy and the sanctity of her methods. Hartwell recorded his observations in hidden pages, a pattern of deliberate depletion, clinical obsession, and rituals performed under the cover of mourning. He feared the garden was being nourished by human diminution. Spring at Crowe Hall arrived like an unearned blessing. Roses overdosed on some secret that made petals thick and perfume heavy enough to dizzy respectable guests. Society praised Evangeline's skill, while the household learned a new, harsher grammar of labor. Martha Henley kept a private ledger of orders and rations, of phrases Evangeline used as if naming crimes. Mourning, vitality, essence cultivation, intensive preparation. The servants were sorted not by ability, but by what the mistress believed each could give. The second death arrived in January. Rebecca Marsh, only 19, collapsed during the pre-dawn regimen. She was gaunt, chemically marked, her hands bearing that same crimson that resisted explanation. In a secret diary Rebecca had smuggled into a mattress seam, she wrote of burns from the fertilizer, of withheld bread, and of invasive vitality checks performed in the cellar, where Evangeline recorded pulses and temperatures with the calm of a practitioner jotting experimental notes. Martha copied passages of Rebecca's diary before burning the original, frightened but determined to preserve evidence in her own careful hand. Her notes described a basement transformed into a counting room, scales and vials, charts linking botanical sketches to skeletal drawings, rows of bottles labeled with names and dates. The language on the pages suggested a theory Evangeline called life transference, the belief that one being's force could be siphoned into another form. The roses responded. Their volume swelled, their fragrance deepened into something almost narcotic. Visitors found themselves forgetful of time and liable to praise whatever Evangeline presented. The garden became both trophy and smokescreen. Dr. Hartwell moved from suspicion to clandestine inquiry. He interviewed servants in whispers, compared dates of illness, and tried to secure samples of the strange residue staining the girls' hands. Evangeline, anticipating scrutiny, produced forged records of care, invitations to the curious, and a cultivated reputation among county families who vouched for her temperament and method. She had become adept at masking ritual with respectability. Publicly, she corresponded with botanists and published notes on grafting and soil amendments. Privately, she kept journals filled with measurements and conjectures that blurred medicine and myth. Hartwell's notes, hidden in his desk, grew more worried with each entry. He could not yet prove malice, only compile a pattern. For now the roses fed on silence, and the silence fed on them. By summer the garden's fame acted as a careful mask. Carriages arrived, visitors praised the blooms and departed with bouquets and gossip, unaware of the ledger of small deaths being written in the servants' quarters. Martha's journal, filled with names and numbers, who endured intensive preparation, who was measured, who was pushed harder. Those selected were often the most capable. The ones Evangeline believed could give most without immediate ruin. Type the veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Dr. Hartwell unearthed a historical echo. In brittle legal files from the early 1700s he found accusations against Mercy Fairfax, a distant ancestor, charged in whispers with cultivating impossible gardens and the vanishing of young women. Courts may have dismissed the charges, but the parallels were too pointed to ignore. Evangeline had learned a different approach than Mercy's exile. She niched herself into respectability, trading seeds with county botanists, exchanging letters with influential matrons, presenting her methods as progressive horticulture while keeping the most damning practices behind drawn curtains. Hartwell found entries in the family paper's recipe fragments, underlined passages, notes that suggested a ritualized horticulture, a theory that life force could be shifted from human to plant. As the doctor pressed, Evangeline's experiments grew more intrusive. She recorded pulse, temperature, the slightest change in color, and collected small samples under the guise of analysis. Servants whispered of bottles labeled with names, charts connecting human anatomy to plant diagrams, and of a contraption Evangeline called her concentrator. Martha attempted quiet rebellion. She hid scraps of bread, plotted exits, spoke in low, urgent tones to the girls. But the household was trapped by dependency, wages, referrals, a roof over their heads, all tied to Evangeline's approval. When Martha protested openly, the mistress replied with a smile that softened the complaint into shame. She reminded Martha of the stability the family provided and the ruin that would follow scandal. One girl, Catherine Walsh, received the worst title. Intensive preparation. She could read quietly and scribbled maps of escape in margins. Each morning at 4 she descended to the cellar, where Evangeline spoke like a mother and a physician, promising that their work fed something noble. "We create a beauty that will outlast us," Evangeline told her. Catherine kept her fear folded like a paper bird in her lap and counted her breaths. Catherine's mornings became an anatomy of endurance. The basement smelled of iron and warmed soil, of tinctures and old wood. Evangeline moved around her with practiced gentleness while taking notes, pulse under thumb, breaths counted like beads, saliva dabbed into labeled vials. The machine she called the concentrator sat in a corner, tubes and bellows repurposed from apothecary parts and medical primers. Evangeline spoke softly, framing the work as sacrifice for posterity. "We are artists and scientists," she would say, pressing a thermometer into a wrist. But the regimen thinned muscles and blunted minds. She sought a substance she named vital tincture. Those who endured it lost their edges. Martha kept watch and stole food where she could, padding hunger with hidden scraps. When she protested new orders, Evangeline replied that the household depended on order and that disruption would cost everyone shelter and wages. Duty, the mistress insisted, was protection. Dr. Hartwell attempted to raise alarm. He brought his notes to magistrates and county colleagues, citing medical signs and diary fragments. Neighbors, impressed by Evangeline's public persona, dismissed him as unsettled. His professional concern was reframed as jealousy. Undeterred, Hartwell worked quietly. He questioned servants in the dark, gathered torn diary pages, and assembled testimony describing the same recurring pattern: overwork, chemical burns, meticulous measurements, and bottles labeled with girls' names. The list of victims, Sarah, Rebecca, and those still unnamed, mapped a cruel ratio. The garden's bounty multiplied as bodies thinned. At night, Hartwell shifted tactics. He walked Crowe's cemetery, matched burial markers to records of decline. He intercepted returned packages and read the notes tucked into seed orders. He paid a gardener to point out the cellar door left unlocked when Evangeline was at the greenhouse. Catherine kept a hidden list sewn into a pillow seam, tallying hours and bucket weights in the margins of her life. She whistled under her breath as she worked, short refrains that marked minutes, and insisted she remained. Hartwell began to draft affidavits, though no hand would yet publicly sign them. Hartwell's affidavits stayed private. Men of influence refused to risk reputations by challenging a woman whose garden set fashion for the county. Evangeline had learned social alchemy, charm, donations, alliances. She arranged teas and loaned plants to parish ladies, and in return the community looked the other way. The deaths continued with bureaucratic silence. A girl would be worked thin over weeks, her vigor measured down to grams. Then a notice of sudden illness would be dispatched to kin. There were no inquests, and those who protested found doors closed to them. Catherine kept small resistances. She learned to pace her breaths, to steady her hands, to hide extra crusts of bread in aprons. When visiting botanists praised Evangeline's hybrids, she smiled without betraying where the roses took their color. Such acts of facade stretched days into weeks. Evangeline's methods hardened into ritual. Midnight plantings were billed as ceremonies, old notes were burned as purification, lines from ancient Fairfax papers were turned into aphorisms. Her private diagrams connected anatomy to pattle, theory to practice, until the idea of life transfer became dogma rather than hypothesis. Martha sent copies of her notes to a cousin in the nearby town pleading for help. He offered nothing but silence. Hartwell pressed on with covert interviews and seam-torn diaries, but the social machinery shielding Evangeline was patient and well-oiled. Hartwell moved into stealth. He followed wagons, opened crates, and copied invoices by candlelight. A stable boy sold him a ledger hidden inside a cooking pot. It showed shipments of strange powders and bottles timed to rose orders. A notation on one bill mentioned an ingredient to bind essence, dated before the very first collapse. He carried that notation like an ember, desperate for corroboration. Evangeline countered by deepening social ties. She staged a charitable exhibition in Richmond, sent bouquets to judges and clergymen, and collected testimonials that could silence inquiry. The public applauded. The private ledger kept tally. The ledger grew. Names that once belonged to laughter and gossip were reduced to dates and last tasks in Hartwell's folio. Evangeline refined her methods, measured fasts, lotions that blistered then soothed, soil deliveries timed to ritual applications. The household moved under a choreography engineered by her notebooks. Martha reached for help from a neighboring minister, hoping church weight could pry open the household's secrecy. He toured the rooms, admired the blooms, and returned to his parish with expressions of sympathy and no action. Later he would explain that he had seen only public sorrow. Visitors reported odd aftereffects from the garden faintness, a hazed memory of names, a lingering confusion that dissolved the edges of a visit. Evangeline presented these instances as eccentricities of genius and the price of rare horticulture. Hartwell discovered a paper in the Fairfax trunk that turned his blood. It detailed a crude practice of amending soil with human byproducts to intensify plant vigor. The verbs matched Evangeline's notebooks: concentrate, transfer, bind. He overlaid his medical notes, cardiac declines, chemical burns, timing of deaths, and realized certain treatments coincided with plant applications. The pattern looked deliberate. Martha taught the remaining girls to deceive as survival, to fake vigor, to obfuscate hours, to stagger labor so no single woman appeared the most vulnerable. For a fleeting season the subterfuge bought them breaths. Evangeline adjusted. She altered schedules, increased dehydrating protocols, and used the concentrator more frequently. The roses responded with an intensified bloom, as if the garden itself understood how to capitalize on secrecy. Pamphlets about Mercy Fairfax circulated, their old accusations gaining new legs. Families whispered about heredity and haunting, about whether cruelty could be an inheritance. The county's polite life creaked as people chose sides. Hartwell, Martha, and Catherine prepared for the next days, knowing each witness might decide the case. The chemist's report pushed Hartwell from private worry into deliberate action. He drafted a careful account and sought signatures from those willing to swear to what they'd seen. It was slow work. Most feared scandal more than collusion. But two small names, a stableman and a laundress, agreed to sign. Their courage made Hartwell's case begin to look like something concrete rather than rumor. Catherine felt the walls close. Evangeline's gaze narrowed, and the mistress answered suspicion with spectacle: public plantings, invited tours, and generous donations that reminded neighbors why she was admired. Behind the display, the seller's work intensified. Bottles multiplied, instruments warmed, and a ledger of measurements grew like a second garden. Martha held secret meetings and taught the girls to rehearse stories, to present alibis that might stand up should officials ask. They rehearsed details until they could speak flatly, without panic, which offered a slender hope that precise testimony might do what whispers could not. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Evangeline staged a night planting that the county press would later call romantic and quaint. Lanterns lit curved paths. Guests praised the spectacle over tea. In private she burned older journals as a ritual of renewal and scattered fresh soil that had been mixed in secret. The act read like purification to those present, but to Hartwell and Martha it felt like a deliberate attempt to erase traces and to recalibrate the garden's appetite. The cellar remained. Behind its door, bottles still lined shelves, labeled in a meticulous script with names and dates. The concentrator hummed and sometimes clicked as if in conversation with the roots. Hartwell, with signatures secured, plotted a formal complaint. He wanted witnesses to the patterns, the deliveries, the grave-digging outings, the timing of collapses, and the jars that bore the servants' names. He did not yet know how to overcome the social machinery that protected Evangeline, but he prepared the papers all the same. With signatures in hand, Hartwell chose to move forward. He would try to pull together enough witnesses that a coroner could not dismiss the pattern. He and Martha agreed to risk everything, to name names, to reveal soil bundles, to show the evidence of bottles and journals. That night the roses seemed to listen, their fragrance braided with fear publicly. Hartwell's attempt to formalize allegations moved along a crooked road. He sought a coroner and a magistrate who would call the kind of inquiry that required courage. He found a reluctant coroner willing to sign a summons if Hartwell could provide testimony robust enough to survive social pressure. So Hartwell and Martha expanded their witness list. Stable hands, seamstresses, a former gardener, those with nothing left to lose. Each signature was a small fracture in the county's bedrock of deference. Catherine, exhausted and watchful, kept her ledger secret and rehearsed her testimony at night, but Evangeline had begun to watch more closely. The mistress summoned Catherine for a new regimen of preparation that promised advancement and the chance to be the face of future botanical papers. In reality, Catherine was placed under an amplified schedule of thirst and work designed to deepen her depletion and to create a dramatic decline that might be written off as natural. Martha discovered Catherine's changed schedule and slipped a note to Hartwell detailing the increased hours and the new mixtures being applied at night. Hartwell moved quickly. He secured an order from the coroner to have Catherine examined, using the signatures as pretext. Evangeline objected, claiming the woman's honor was being impugned. She wrote polite letters to neighbors and used her social circle to denounce Hartwell's methods as invasive. The coroner's order arrived just in time. The medical examination found Catherine feverish and dehydrated. The unknown crimson residue remained on her hands. Hartwell documented chemical irritation and signs of systematic depletion consistent with his earlier suspicions. The coroner, presented with a living, testable body, could not dismiss everything as mere misfortune. An inquest was scheduled. News of the inquest rippled through the county like a sudden cold wind. Some neighbors recoiled in private, others publicly praised the court's attention. Evangeline convened allies and threatened quietly to withdraw patronage from families who did not stand by her. The calculus of loyalty tightened, yet now the garden's central secret was vulnerable in a way it had never been. Hartwell assembled proofs, ledger pages hidden in a sewing box, vials taken from the cellar, and a cup of soil smuggled from Sarah's grave. Fairfax marginalia, he noticed, echoed Evangeline's rituals and tied past accusation to present horror too. The inquest met in the county room, smelling of dust and candle tallow. A small coroner's jury assembled, local men tasked with deciding whether to pursue a full trial. Hartwell spoke with the steadiness of a man who had measured suffering. He laid out pulse charts, diary excerpts, chemistry notes, and the dates of soil transfers. To those schooled in observation, his case was precise and alarming. Martha read the copied diary passages with a voice that quivered but did not break. She described Sarah's collapse, Rebecca's burns and nighttime expeditions to the family graveyard where soil was lifted and returned to the garden. Her testimony landed like a stone. Catherine took the stand and was asked to recount days and hours. Her voice was thin but steady as she described the concentrator and the bottles labeled with servants' names. The coroner's physician noted her dehydration and unexplained staining and agreed the physical signs matched Hartwell's descriptions. A chemist from Richmond, called in quietly by Hartwell, explained the altered organic matter found in the samples and the presence of binding agents not typically used in ordinary gardening. Evangeline arrived robed in composure. She presented letters of endorsement from prominent women, testimonials praising her horticultural gifts, and a polished persona that argued social ruin would be unjust. She framed the allegations as slanderous and suggested servants might have motives for falsehood. Her performance swayed some jurors who preferred the comfort of pedigree over the discomfort of accusation. Cross-examinations were brutal. In their simplicity, witnesses doubted, names were contested, motives suggested. Yet the physical evidence remained: altered soil, vials with labeled names corroborating diary excerpts, and a living woman whose body bore marks of deliberate deprivation. The coroner's jury adjourned to deliberate, and the county sensed that something significant had shifted. For the first time, Evangeline's cultivated shield had real holes in it. The jury returned with a decision there was sufficient cause for a fuller legal proceeding. The coroner's jury issued a formal order for an inquest to become an indictment. The news moved across the county like a stone through still water. Social circles tightened and gossip sputtered into fearful murmurs. Evangeline received the news with a practiced softness. She met neighbors in parlors and spoke of the pain of accusation, of the scandal that threatened everything she had cultivated. Privately, she turned to strategies of delay and persuasion, letters to influential men, offers of funds to local causes, and veiled reminders of the assistance she'd provided to families in need. She also sought legal counsel, employing a lawyer with a reputation for smoothing over county embarrassments. Hartwell and Martha did what they could to protect witnesses. Catherine was moved to the house of a distant cousin under the cover of a sewing circle. Her testimony would be supervised, but the cousin promised sanctuary. The stableman and laundress who had signed witness later withdrew for fear of social and economic retaliation, but their names remained on Hartwell's papers, Others stepped in to corroborate where possible. The county divided braced for the next phase. Some families feared losing invitations and business if they supported prosecution. Others, quietly appalled, prepared to testify. Evangeline's social capital became a battleground. She traded favors and threatened with the careful cruelty of someone who could make a livelihood vanish. Hartwell knew that legal victory would not be enough. The defense could manufacture doubt or besmirch witnesses' pasts. Yet the presence of physical evidence and living testimony made the case harder to ignore. Living testimony made the case harder to dismiss. Because marks on bodies and labeled bottles answered the rhetoric of reputation with material fact and stubborn proof. Evangeline's counteroffensive was patient and creative. She wrote elegant letters that read like confessions of sorrow and prudence. She offered donations to the parish and to local schools, and she quietly threatened to withdraw support from any family that lent public aid to prosecution. Her lawyer filed motions that delayed proceedings on technicalities and demanded more precise evidence and witness attestations. The machinery of law, polite, meticulous, and slow, began to stumble under Evangeline's resources. Then catastrophe struck in a way that smelled of both mischance and intention. One of Hartwell's earliest informants, a gardener who had shown the doctor the cellar hinges, was found dead beneath a cart wheel. The coroner listed the cause as accident. Those who suspected foul play were hushed by the official record. The event sent a chill through Hartwell's small coalition. Fear spread among potential witnesses and some retreated into silence. Martha took the loss as a private threat. She redoubled efforts to move evidence out of the house and into safer hands. She burned nothing now she hid. She sewed the remaining pages of diaries into coats and passed vials wrapped in oilcloth to travelers heading for the next county. Hartwell petitioned the magistrate for protection for witnesses, but the county's magistrates were themselves entangled in webs of courtesy and mutual advantage. Still, there were cracks in Evangeline's armor. The coroner, listening to evidence of chemical alteration and to Catherine's visible debilitation, ordered more formal examinations. The public began to argue in parlor rooms and taverns over whether a woman's social standing should excuse terrible acts. Old pamphlets about Mercy Fairfax were recirculated, and where once the memory had been dismissed as superstition, now it read like unfinished testimony passed through generations. In the house itself, Evangeline did not panic. She doubled down. New rituals were adopted under the pretense of ancestral preservation. She brought in rarer soils and foreign powders, and the roses swelled with even richer color. Those who worked under her hands felt the regimen accelerate. Their days became less their own and more instruments of an experiment that stitched together science, grief, and a logic older than propriety. The county's appetite for explanation would have to contend with a woman who had learned to cloak cruelty in civility and to make beauty her most persuasive alibi. The trial opened to a hungry public. Courthouse benches filled with neighbors, tradesmen, and ladies in stiff bonnets, while reporters scribbled with an appetite for scandal. Evangeline hired polished counsel who spoke in velvet about misinterpretation, about the dangers of rumor. But Hartwell's testimony was clinical and clear. He explained the pattern: burns on palms, progressive emaciation, and the presence of foreign pigments on skin. He described the concentrator in sober terms and explained how repeated deprivation could render the body a receptacle for whatever the soil required. His voice was steady. Jurors who had once admired Evangeline's roses looked away at his words. Martha and the stableman offered corroboration of odd deliveries and of night diggings at the family grave. The chemist from Richmond repeated his analysis in court, and the bottles and labeled vials were entered into evidence under careful oath. Each object made the story harder to dismiss as mere gossip. Catherine's testimony was the center of the room. She spoke of early hours and labored breathing, of Evangeline's soft voice in the cellar, and the way measurements erased a person's privacy. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to paint her as a servant motivated by resentment. They implied debts, imagined fits of spite, and suggested that hunger and bad luck explained what Hartwell described. Yet Catherine's composure survived the assault. She read from her own hidden ledger, reciting details, timings, quantities, and names in the margins now. Evangeline took the stand, poised and composed. She spoke of devotion to beauty, the misunderstandings of those who saw only a mistress and not a bereaved woman experimenting with remedies. Her rhetoric swayed some spectators. She framed herself as a pioneer and a lady wrongly accused. Her letters of support and the glow of her cultivated persona shored up defenders in the audience. Yet the collated evidence, the soil samples, vials, medical observations, and living testimony, formed a lattice that charm could not fully unweave. The prosecution had moved from whispers to documentation, and that shift made the county uneasy. For the first time, Evangeline's roses might be seen as proof as well as ornament. Pamphlets about Mercy Fairfax circulated, their old accusations gaining new legs. Families whispered about heredity and haunting, about whether cruelty could be an inheritance. The county's polite life creaked as people chose sides. Hartwell, Martha, and Catherine prepared for the next days, knowing each witness might decide the case. The defense worked to peel away the prosecution. They summoned respected botanists who explained how dyes and soil amendments could stain hands and cause chemical irritation, and they pressed Hartwell on the limits of inference. They suggested servants might misremember or exaggerate under fear. Several intimidated witnesses softened earlier statements or withdrew together, driven by dread of social ruin and economic retaliation. The courtroom tempered. The prosecution's momentum wavered as jurors considered the danger of condemning a woman of standing on uncertain testimony. Outside the walls, sympathetic neighbors counseled caution. Evangeline's letters and gifts were deployed to reinforce loyalty. Her network worked quietly to isolate those who spoke openly. The defense argued that misfortune, hunger, and overwork explained what looked like pattern and urged the jury to require ironclad proof before jeopardizing reputations. Martha, however, found an object that altered the balance. While retrieving preserved pages she had sewn into bedding, she discovered a small bound fragment that had been charred at the edges. The handwriting matched Evangeline's cramped script. The fragment recorded dates and notations about mixtures and used the terms concentrate and essence. It paired names with times and suggested schedules that aligned with the documented collapses. Burn marks indicated someone had tried to destroy the record. What remained was nevertheless damning in its specificity. Hartwell had the fragment authenticated and cross-referenced it against chemist reports and ledger copies. The prosecution could now present a paper trail, charred notes that seemed to be Evangeline's own, bottles with labels, soil samples, and living testimony. The defense attacked provenance and context, arguing scorched distortions and innocent meanings. Yet for jurors who had wavered, the fragment and the physical evidence created a gravity that could not be easily dismissed. The county divided into camps of fear and resolve. Some families retreated from involvement, unwilling to risk social standing. Others found courage enough to stand by testimony. The trial had become a contest not merely of words but of material proof. In the courthouse margins, reputations were counted and purchased, and justice looked less like a blind scale and more like an arena where power and truth collided. Evangeline watched developments with studied calm, increased patronage, and privately destroyed notes. She spoke of sorrow while evidence mounted. The county felt as if it stood on a knife's edge, awaiting the jury's final movement. Every family calculated risk and loyalty in hushed tones. Closing arguments distilled the trial into two competing accounts. The prosecution recited a string of material facts, measurements of decline, receipts for exotic powders, soil samples linked to family graves, and a charred fragment in Evangeline's handwriting that referenced concentration and paired names with dates. Hartwell spoke with sober intensity about the moral duty to protect the vulnerable and urged the jurors to let the data, not deference, govern their judgment. The defense answered with rhetoric shaped to social feeling. Evangeline's counsel described eccentricity and grief, invoked the risk of wrecking a woman's reputation, and presented letters from respected citizens attesting to her benevolence. He suggested that scientific inference could be overstretched, that burns might be accidents, and that servants, frightened and under pressure, could produce false stories. He asked jurors to consider the cost of error. Martha's testimony left her pale but determined. Catherine's steady voice returned again and again to detail and habit. The judge instructed jurors to weigh facts, assess credibility, and apply law without passion. The jury withdrew to deliberate. Outside, conversations quickened. Neighbors debated allegiance, while merchants pondered the economic consequences of choosing sides. At Crowe Hall, the roses glowed as if tasting consequence. Evangeline walked them each morning with a hand that measured stems and a face that avoided the servants' eyes. Martha used any excuse to move papers and vials out of the house, slipping samples to trusted hands beyond county borders. Hartwell prepared further testimony and gathered corroboration, knowing that proving motive would be harder than proving pattern. Neighbors who had once traded gossip and flowers now calculated loyalties like merchants setting a price. Some declined to speak for fear of losing patronage, while others mustered courage to testify. The village's polite order creaked as reputations and livelihoods were weighed against conscience. Evangeline increased her public gifts and wrote elegant letters asking for reason. Her lawyer pressed procedural challenges and argued that charred ink could mislead. The jury's decision, to be rendered soon, would articulate what the county would tolerate: the protection of a lady's standing or the public acknowledgement that beauty had been purchased at an unbearable cost. The sleeping town held its breath as petals filled the night air with their heavy scent. The roses felt like small judges, watching and keeping count. The jury's return was a moment that snapped the county into attention. After days of deliberation, they found Evangeline guilty on charges tied to systematic maltreatment and the deaths of her servants. The verdict landed with the weight of inevitability for some and scandal for others. Gasps and sobs rippled through the courthouse. Evangeline received the news with a face that was oddly serene, a practiced composure that read like resolve. Word spread quickly. Some neighbors wept with relief, feeling that the vanished had been named and that law had finally pierced old deference. Others whispered that the court had overreached, that a lady's indiscretions had been misinterpreted as monstrosity. Evangeline's social circle recoiled, invitations halted, and donations were quietly rescinded. Her lawyer moved immediately to file appeals, buying time and threading procedural delays through the legal machinery. Back at Crowe Hall, the garden took on the hush of a place preparing for something final. Evangeline walked the rows of roses at dusk, her hands tracing familiar stems. Behind her composed face there was a plan no tribunal could touch, a ritual she had refined in private. Years of measurements and mixtures that she believed might convert outward devotion into inward preservation. She had stocked the concentrator and kept vials hidden for contingencies. Now, with a verdict hanging over her, she planned one final public experiment to transference life into bloom and insist her methods were justified before. Evangeline announced her demonstration as an act of contrition and science. Invitations went to the court, to county patrons, and to any who ever praised her roses. The garden was lit with lanterns, paths were swept, and benches arranged. People came expecting theater or repentance. Some came for closure, others for spectacle. Hartwell and Martha stood among the crowd, hearts thudding like trapped birds. They had a plan to intervene if needed. She opened by reciting a litany drawn from Fairfax papers, words that sounded both learned and ritual. The concentrator sat in a central place, bellows-ready vials at its feet. Catherine, not yet freed but escorted under protection, watched from the fringe. Evangeline spoke about beauty and preservation with a voice that made some listeners weep. She spoke about the debt owed to memory and the legitimacy of experiment. Then she asked for volunteers to assist her. None stepped forward. She turned to herself. In a moment like a sacrament, she explained she would attempt a controlled transference, to seed the roses with her own concentrated force so that her name would outlast scandal. Hartwell's protests were lost in the hush. The judge and magistrates looked on, unsure whether to intervene. Evangeline's hands moved with cold precision, measuring a tincture she had prepared in secret, and she invited the public to witness the final proof of her theory. Martha, sensing danger, pushed through the crowd and grabbed a lantern to throw at the apparatus. Hartwell pulled her back, pleading that violence would only provide Evangeline with martyrs and further public confusion. A scuffle pushed the edges of decorum. Evangeline, ignoring the chaos, uncorked a vial and poured its contents toward a bed of central roses, speaking phrases that sounded like prayer and calculation. For a few heartbeats the garden inhaled. The flowers shivered as if tuned to a particular frequency, their colors deepening until they looked stitched from dark velvet. Then something broke the hush. A soft tearing sound like fabric ripping, and Evangeline screamed. She clutched at her throat, and for a terrifying instant it seemed as if the vines themselves were answering. Hands reached for her, some to help, some to hold at bay, and the public staggered toward the beds, as if toward an altar. She collapsed onto the earth, the roses surged in color, and then, grotesquely, began to blacken. The chaos after Evangeline's collapse was immediate and absolute. People surged into the beds, some to help, some to claim witness, and some to clutch proof of their own interpretation. The magistrate called for silence. The coroner's men wrapped Evangeline's body and removed her with ritualized caution. The roses, once swollen with saturation, blackened at the edges as if a disease had been called forth. Where petals had been thick and luminous, rot like ink spread through veins. The county found itself at a strange crossroad. Some claimed a miraculous justice had occurred. The woman who fed herself on others had been consumed by the very plants she cherished. Others argued accident, that a tincture accidentally contaminated her, or that stress had produced a sudden collapse. Newspapers rolled the story into sensational columns, while parishioners debated whether the event was divine judgment or tragic folly. Hartwell and Martha took control of the remaining evidence with a new urgency. They catalogued the burned fragments, the vials, and the soil smuggled from graves. Hartwell insisted on a post-mortem that would record the chemical traces in Evangeline's system. The coroner obliged. The results would be published and also hidden among private correspondences. The fragment offered earlier now served as a map, names aligned to dates and treatments that connected the garden's vigor to human diminishment. Martha found, in the aftermath, more papers that implicated practices passed down through Fairfax generations. Not merely recipe notes, but an ideological lineage that rationalized the use of devotion as a resource. It read like a lineage of secrecy, accusations pushed into the margins of history reappearing as modern methods. The county's polite historians began to realize that Mercy Fairfax's accusations had been more than superstition. They were an earlier turn in a cycle of secrecy and justification. People who had accepted bouquets now stood apart. Those who had shouted praise now avoided mention of Crowe Hall. Some of the former defenders regretted too late loyalty. Others rationed their outrage with pragmatic excuses. The garden itself, half black and strewn with trampled stems, became both crime scene and testament. A place where beauty had been bartered for lives, and where silence had bought a dangerous kind of splendor. In private letters, Hartwell urged reform protections for servant labor, coroner oversight, and community accountability. The county, bruised, began a slow, uneasy reckoning that would last generations. Evangeline's death complicated the legal arc. The indictment that had promised a public reckoning ended with a different conclusion. Courts could not prosecute a corpse, and appeals and civil suits shifted into private settlements and sealed discussions. Yet the facts Evangeline's trial had exposed could not be fully buried. Hartwell's reports, the chemist's analyses, and Martha's preserved pages circulated in learned circles and official correspondence, prompting inquiries beyond the county's borders. Those inquiries revealed that Crowe Hall's practices were not a single aberration, but part of a quiet tradition. Notes and marginalia found in other family collections suggested that the idea of sacrificing labor for botanical gain had circulated among a few landed households across the region. Mercy Fairfax's accusations, once dismissed as superstition, emerged as an early fragment in a network of secrecy that had mutated into experimental practice. The revelation was small but seismic. The county's recoveries could be arranged only by patience and human vigilance. Catherine, having recovered in the care of a cousin, chose not to vanish back into servitude. She refused offers that promised comfort in exchange for silence, and instead learned to read more deeply, to keep records, and to teach other young women how to protect themselves. She began to travel under an assumed name, working with a circle of women who taught one another practical skills and how to record injustice with care. A living archive built from the margins. Martha received a modest pension arranged by Hartwell and sympathetic neighbors, and she used part of it to fund a small school for girls where literacy and the law were taught together. Hartwell, whose reputation had been nearly destroyed by social pressure, found his stature restored in part. His medical notes were cited in lectures about workplace welfare and the duties of guardianship. The county changed in small ways. Employers faced more scrutiny, coroner procedures were tightened, and some local customs were questioned. Still, the older pattern had not vanished. In other estates, whispers continued, practices adapted and retreated into quieter forms. The Fairfax Fragment's echo reminded those who read it that institutional secrecy could survive decades, and that change required more than a verdict. The tale of Crowe Hall became a cautionary manuscript, how beauty could be built on denial, and how truth required stubborn work to reveal and human vigilance. Years later, the place where Crowe Hall's roses had once stunned strangers with unnatural color was a field of uneven grass and tangled roots. Some beds were left to decay, others were replanted with sober hedges. The county tried to fold the story into a lesson without spectacle: small legal reforms, improved oversight of domestic labor, and a quiet, practical education for girls that taught both reading and rights. But folklore is not so easily tamed. The story of Evangeline Crowe became a parable passed in kitchen light, and at market stalls a warning about beauty and appetite. Catherine's small school kept a leather-bound book where girls wrote down their own days, names, and small injustices, evidence for the future. Hartwell lectured on workplace duty and ethics until he could no longer rise in public, and Martha took to advising families on household oversight. The Fairfax Fragment found its way into an academic archive where scholars argued about continuity and deviation, about how old ideas mutate into new social practices. Some older families tried to erase their involvement, others confessed privately and worked to make restitution. The county's polite society continued to spin, but with a faint knot of unease under its ribbons. People who had taken roses for granted now checked their hands for unfamiliar stains and asked questions about labor when a bouquet arrived at a parlor table. In quiet conversation, elders recounted that beauty could be purchased in many currencies, not all of them visible. As for Evangeline's garden, vines grew through broken arches and winter took what summer had given. Where once petals shone like lacquer, now moss crept between thorns and birds nested in collapsed trellises. The earth remembered. The roses that had fed on sacrifice rusted into the soil they had once consumed, and the land reclaimed its own patterning. Listen now, as someone who has walked that path, and read those ledgers. Histories of small cruelties can be hidden under the loveliest things. Learning the names of those who were used and spoken for is an act of undoing. If this tale has shifted something in you, that is its purpose. To make you more watchful, more unwilling to let beauty shelter violence. Carry the story as a lamp, tend to truth where you find it, and remember that the most dangerous gardens are the quiet ones we do not inspect. Speak the names, guard the ledger, and never look away.